All right, our next lesson for U.S. wars is going to be on, well, the largest invasions in the history of all mankind, Operation Barbarossa. Essentially, this is the name of the operation given to the German or Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Surprise attack, really. I'll explain that as we go on. But just give you a little bit of a basic purview. I'll be getting into a lot of the strategy and things and motivations behind this. Towards the end of this lesson, we're going to be getting in some topics that really get into, well, let's just say they don't make you feel too happy, just to give you a little bit of a preference into this one. But that being said, moving on. Now, before we can talk about this, we need to talk about something we haven't really focused on that much up to this point. I've alluded to it here and there. Yes, we've talked about the rise of dictators. We've talked about Hitler's idea for a better Germany, but I haven't gone into this one yet, and that is what's called Lebensraum. Hitler's overall goal essentially was this, something called Lebensraum. We talked about the idea that, yes, he wanted to have a new master race and a world order based around it, but he also wanted the land for those people, meaning that he didn't want to see Germany held to its traditional borders. He wanted to see a new Germany that was massive and huge. But of course, all land around Germany is already populated, so depopulate them. This is a direct quote from Adolf Hitler. Poland will be depopulated and settled with Germans. The fate of Russia will be exactly the same. I mean, that is definitely a genocidal quote right there. And so if you're seeing a picture of Europe in your mind right now, think of this. The entire area that is Poland is supposed to be depopulated with anybody who's of a Slavic background, the ethnicity of Slavs, which are the majority ethnicity there, is also the majority ethnicity in Russia as well. In Hitler's mind, they do not belong in the master race. The Slavic peoples don't belong at all. If any Slavs survive World War and survive into his utopia, they'll be a slave race. People essentially work the plantations for their German masters. That is kind of the end goal. And he envisioned a new Germany. I probably should show like a map of this, but he envisioned a new Germany stretching all the way out to the Ural Mountains of west central Russia. That'd be all this land, and he kind of envisioned German pioneers going in to settle the land, a lot like American pioneers went to settle the West. He was way into that. So, this is the reasonings behind things like the Holocaust. And if you're realizing just yet what we know to be the Holocaust and the over 10 million people that died in what is the Holocaust during World War II is really a drop in the bucket compared to what he was really going for. What is just absolutely scary and mind-numbing to think of, that he was really going into it, or that was his thought process. He thought that much death was needed to achieve the utopia that he was hoping for. By the way, the picture on the bottom left there is Hitler talking with a bunch of troops before he launches the invasion into Russia, essentially telling them, you don't, normal war rules and rules of engagement don't, it doesn't work this time around. You guys don't need to follow those strictures. We're going to kill all these guys anyways, so do what you need to do type thing. Okay. So, I've already been talking about Lebensraum this whole time, just brought it up there. But Lebensraum, by the way, means living space in German. Okay. Now, when it comes down to the actual invasion of the Soviet Union, this is a massive undertaking. I mean, the largest land empire known to ever, except for the Mongolian Empire, but definitely at this time the largest land empire at this point. And he's going to invade it. That's going to take a lot of planning and a lot of execution and really just a lot of luck when it comes down to it. And him and his generals kind of knew that. They felt confident, but they knew it was going to focus down to three main targets. The Germans felt like if they could hit three main targets and take all three, Russia would fold, that they would keel over and be done. So first target was Leningrad off to the north there, if you're seeing that. In fact, they call it Army Group North as their main target. As a way to cut off supplies coming from places like Britain and then later on even the United States. Cut off and then allow more supplies from Germany to come in, to more enable a push in. then Stalingrad was a major thing they knew they needed to take, because that was where, it's right on the Volga River, where a lot of the oil is coming up from the Caucasus area. Caucasus area down here, a lot of oil fields down here. If you could take Stalingrad, you cut Russia off from their oil, essentially stopping their armies. They can't move against you without oil. And the last step, Moscow, kind of like cutting the head off of the snake. Get rid of the political leaders, get rid of Stalin and all the other Soviet leaders, and essentially with that loss of political leadership, the loss of supplies from Leningrad, the loss of oil from Stalingrad, it's a done deal. They should be able to win this thing. So that's essentially the thing, and they divided the plan, and they divided their army up into 3 major army groups to do this. Army Group North going towards Leningrad, Army Group Center going towards Moscow, Army Group South going towards Stalingrad. Okay, now, in preparing for this, this is a lot of guys. Although, just knowing the world wars, like World War I and World War II, there's always this like, and this is the largest ever. And then like, even within the war itself, it one-ups itself. This is the largest amphibious landing ever until the next largest amphibious landing ever. This is the largest land invasion ever until the next largest land invasion ever. This is the most people died in a battle ever until the next battle the most people died ever. That's kind of the way the world wars go. It just keeps getting worse, bigger and worse each time. But in this case, 3.5 million men. That's roughly 6 to 7 times larger than the army that Napoleon Bonaparte got together, the Grand Army, 130 years earlier, to take out Russia, which didn't work, by the way. They didn't have enough of their own people for this. They didn't have enough German soldiers to do this, so they had to get all their allies in it. And those Italians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Hungarians. There was even a Spanish battalion, I believe, called the Blue Battalion, or the Blue something. I think it was called the Blue Battalion, but there's Spanish involved with this. Volunteers, you could say, because Spain was essentially neutral. But they launched this major attack. 3,000 tanks, almost 3,000 planes. And this is just a huge, huge undertaking. And in the beginning, it goes off incredibly well. Better than they could have ever imagined. Better than all of their own plans and predictions even called for. They just run over the Russians and take a lot of territory incredibly quickly. The blitzkrieg tactic works incredibly well. I'm not going to explain blitzkrieg again because we did that in the beginning of World War II lesson. But if you're just looking at that map right there, just all those black arrows and the area they take, they essentially take most all of that territory within the first month to month and a half of their push. But then they do start getting stalled a little bit. And they don't get stalled off of normal things you think of, like supply lines a little bit, yes, or weather, or hard defensive fighting, or they get stalled really by their own arguing. I'll go into that in a little bit. But just know that it was just easy to push in. The thing I'd like to point out right now, though, that we know today, they didn't know back then. Hitler did not know this. All evidence points to the fact that he didn't even know this, even though he used this as an excuse to start it. Oh, I didn't explain this. Hitler told the German people that the reason why they needed to invade the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was planning to invade them anyways, and in order to achieve their new world order, that there was no place for the Soviet Union in it, so it was their moral duty to get rid of them, destroy them, destroy those Marxists, destroy those communists, destroy those Slavic peoples is really what it came down to, more than anything else. But we're pretty sure today that Hitler had no clue that Stalin and the Russians were actually planning to attack him as well. And that one of the reasons why it was so easy for the German military to roll over the Russians and destroy them is the Russians were in a mentality of getting prepared to do their own attack. And so since they were in preparations of attacking, they were nowhere near in the idea of trying to get ready to defend themselves. And essentially they got caught with their pants down type thing. And most of their initial soldiers and all of their war equipment was destroyed and captured really early on in the first couple weeks of this invasion, and they just retreated from that point on. Stalin was just he couldn't believe it. He was in a state of just shock this entire time. Anyway, by the way, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union at this time, I think we've explained that well enough at this point. Anyways, the map you see there shows a lot of these major pockets of defense where the Russians try to hold out but just don't, and they just get crushed. I'll just give you some statistics here. The Minsk pocket, 350,000 Russian troops captured. Smolensk pocket, over 500,000 captured, but in Smolensk they realize that they're dead if they do, they're dead if they don't. I'll explain that in a second. And they actually make a break for it, and then almost half, I shouldn't say half, but between a third to half of them actually do escape, but a lot of them die in the escape as well. And then the largest, arguably the largest victory for the Axis powers, for everybody told of all of World War II, was the destruction of the Russian army around the Kiev pocket, and that's in present-day Ukraine. Down here, by the way, 650,000 captured. Notice this is captured after all the death. You know, how many died leading up to that and how many died afterwards. Well, to give you a little bit of an idea of that one, again, this is a war of annihilation. Hitler himself called it that, and I showed you some quotes early on that one. They'll be depopulated. Why keep these people around? So usually the Russians try to find any way possible, not the Russians, sorry. Well, later on the Russians too, but because of what the Germans do, you could argue, definitely argue, the Germans just, they let them all die. There's some pretty horrid stories about how the Germans would just treat these Russian prisoners because they didn't view them as people in the first place. Well, we don't want you around anyways, so we'll just let you die. Without going into too many stories at this point, just a little statistic. It's believed that less than, about 9 to 10% of all Russians captured by the Germans in World War II survive, meaning that 9 in 10 chance you were dead if you were captured by the Germans. So, and that was learned pretty early on in this Operation Barbarossa. Within the first 3 months of it, most of the Russian prisoners were not being treated well and mostly getting killed off. Look, the Kiev pocket, if you're talking about only 1 out of 10 people surviving that means that 60,000 people out of that Kiev pocket actually survived World War II. The rest of them were killed off in prisoner of war camps or just killed off. That's staggering amounts. And those are numbers that don't even go into the Holocaust, by the way. That's not part of the Holocaust. That's just part of the deaths of World War II. Separate, by the way. Well, when you look at military deaths versus deaths due to genocide, the genocide of the Holocaust, this is deaths due to the war, but it's still genocide in a way. It's just craziness, essentially. When the Russians realize that's the way it is, well, it's like, you can almost say like this is one of the things where the Germans or Hitler himself shoots himself in the foot. The Russians probably would have lost. They probably would have lost all heart to fight if they didn't think that they were dead anyways. Anyways, I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later in some of the other slides as we move on here. But yeah, the Russians essentially realize, I better fight anyways. Dead if I do, dead if I don't. I'll go down fighting. So anyways, this is actually where I was going to talk about that. I thought there was another slide in between, but in comes a group called the Einsatzgruppen. This, by the way, the deaths I'm going to talk about here are deaths that are coupled, I believe, coupled into the Holocaust, overall deaths of the Holocaust, because this is just unreal. Like, this is the stuff you write in fantasy books and alternate reality books. It doesn't seem like it really happened in human history yet. This did. Basically, because things seem so easy that it seemed like Russia was easily going to be defeated. I keep saying Russia. I should say the Soviet Union. I'm sorry. Because the Soviet Union seemed like it was going to be so easy to roll over them. They're going to lose. They're putting up no real good defense. Hitler and the Nazis, like actual Nazis, and the Nazi Party with that mindset, thought there was no reason not to start the idea of building this new world order. So they send out these death squads called the Einsatzgruppen. And their entire purpose was to go through all these conquered territories of like Poland, the Baltic states, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, especially Soviet Union areas, and kill off all the people that they don't feel like deserve to be around. Now they do this systematically. They target the Jews first. They don't just kill Jews, though. Anybody that really they see as a problem, some people are going to get in the way, people won't fit in the New World Order, they're dead too. But a lot of times they realize, well, get the Jews first, because they could actually get a lot of communities to turn against Jews in their own communities because they didn't like them in the first place. Like I've talked about before in other lessons, there's a lot of anti-Semitism at this point. Jews are they're not liked very much at this point, or ever in world history, it seems like. And so it was actually easy to get people like the Ukrainians to turn against Jews in Ukraine, to get Belarusians to turn against Jews in Belarusia, to get Poles to turn against Jews in Poland. We have more than enough evidence and stories on that one where it's just the depravity of how bad humans can get against other humans. So, but the Zion's group and stuff is just, it's the systematic just destruction of entire groups of people, starting with the Jews. And by the way, it's understood that they did it. That most all of these kind of rural areas in the Soviet Union and Poland and Ukraine, Baltic states, that they pretty much wiped out the entire population of the Jews in those areas. Like the Jews that survived the Holocaust were ones really that were the ones found out hiding out later, the ones in larger metropolitan areas from places like Poland or Germany or France, that end up surviving because they couldn't kill them fast enough. That sounds weird, but it's the best way I can explain it in a short way of explaining it without going into major details. I don't like talking about it as much because it's just so horrific. But it's something that does need to be known at this time period. This is part of World War II. This is part of Operation Barbarossa and the war between Germany and the Soviet Union. The problem here is that Jews were targeted first, but they do start targeting Slavic peoples as well. In fact, there's lots of stories where a lot of groups of people, Ukrainians especially in Baltic states, like Latvians and Estonians, they welcome the Germans as liberators, thinking, thank you for saving us from the evil Soviets, because they did not like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has a lot of crimes against humanity going on themselves that I've not been able to talk about. If you haven't heard about the Holodomor, look up the Holodomor. Bad stuff. So, Stalin killed more people than Hitler did, if you did not know that. Stalin is responsible for more deaths due to genocide than Hitler is. That's crazy. Now, to compare those two, by the way, is like comparing oranges to oranges. They're both very evil men. Stalin just killed more people, and the Ukrainians and Estonians and Latvians were the targets a lot of times of his brutality, especially Ukrainian farmers. But then the Germans come in and do the same thing. So they're accepted as liberators, and then they start with their Einsatzgruppen groups, killing everybody off as well, and making these, especially people like in Ukraine and Belarus, they're realizing the Russians want to kill us, the Germans want to kill us. We're some of the most screwed people of all time. Jews at the top of that list at this point. It's just it's one of those things where you're just so happy to be living over here that your ancestors hopefully were over here at this time, or if they weren't, they probably came over here because of stuff like this happening. Anyways, just messed up. Moving on. And I'm not going to make it sound any better. In fact, here's some pictures from these are pictures that the Einsatzgruppen themselves took. I'll just explain the one on the top left. That is a picture that's titled "The Last Jew in Venetia." If I'm remembering my numbers right, there was something like 40,000 Jews living in the area, and the Einsatzgruppen death squads killed all of them, this guy being the last guy that they executed. Again, these are horrific pictures you're looking at. If you need to fast forward, feel free to do so. Just mind-numbing, just how bad it is. So, but back to the invasions. I said earlier that the Germans started getting stalled a little bit. Well, Army Group North only gets stalled when they actually reach their destination. They get to Leningrad, and they start to besiege the city. And Adolf Hitler decides there's no need for the city. Let's just kill everybody in it and destroy the city. Just wipe it out. So the Germans start bombing it and doing artillery bombardments of it, just to essentially wipe the city out. Under normal circumstances, the city would have surrendered. They would have let the Germans in as the conquerors. and just kind of going out their daily lives. But when the people of Leningrad realized we're dead if we do, we dead if we don't, they put up with some pretty staunch resistance. But man, it gets bad in there. For instance, this last almost 2 years, of the couple million people trapped in there, over 1 million freeze or starved to death or killed due to the bombing or bombardments. I'm showing you pictures here, but just people just falling over, keeling over the middle of the street, usually from the cold. And you get your water from melting ice in the streets. Usually in that ice is around dead bodies that have been frozen up in it as well. There was a lake next to Leningrad that the Soviet army tried to get supplies into it, like on sleds. That's what you're seeing in the bottom right. They could never bring enough in. It's hard to keep a couple million people alive day by day. They're making bread out of like sawdust and paint chips. Like it's just, and then they're limiting how much you can get of that bread. Yeah, it was just a bad situation in Leningrad. Just to give you a little bit of an idea here. In Leningrad alone, more Russians are killed, more Soviets are killed than all the deaths that the Allies have, or at least the British and Americans have combined. Like they lose more people just in that one city than we have total British and American deaths in World War I and World War II. So they pretty much saying that the Eastern Front, what is known as the Eastern Front, because of the German invasion of Russia, is arguably the worst place to be in all of world history when it comes to just the amount of death and destruction. Now, of course, you could argue like, well, it was pretty bad to be in China when Japan was going through there, like we talked about in our last lesson. And yeah, that's a good argument there too. But again, this is where you see the most of it, like just on even much larger scale. Anyways, so I don't know if you didn't notice there's counts of cannibalism in there. So at this point, though, even with Leningrad under siege, and it looks like it's about to go down, the Russian army in full retreat, Hitler is quoted to say, "You only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come down," speaking of the Soviet Union. And the thing is, they start running into a bit of a supply issue. Like all their armies are pushing forward so fast that it's hard to keep supplies up with all of them at once. So it's decided, all right, we need to choose. Do we give all our resources to Army Group South to push and deal with the resistance in Kiev? Or do we give all our supplies to Army Group Center and have them push into Moscow and cut the head off of the snake? The Germans, the generals, and Hitler argue for weeks about this one. Essentially through the month of September, they're arguing about this. And Hitler pretty much gets his way and decides to divert mostly supplies south and divert a lot of Army Group Center down south to help out. And they're able to take Kiev, and it's again one of the largest victories ever for the Axis powers for Germany, and capturing those 650,000 soldiers. But it did stop them from going forward along the whole front. And then, unluckily for them, in October of 1941. What are called the November rains come early. These are freezing rains that are supposed to come in during November. They come in October instead, and they make it impossible to go forward. Like I'm showing pictures that will hopefully help you get an idea of just you can't even get tanks through that. The tanks would burn out their motors, so they're just at a dead stop. Everything's at a dead stop. This was very fortuitous for the Russians because it gave them, for the Soviets, it gave them a chance to get a breather, start building up some defenses, getting their citizens out there to build anti-tank traps and trenches and other lay mines and things like that. And something that also helped out the Soviets a lot was, and this is something the Germans did not count on because they thought nobody does this, they incorporated a lot of women into their military. Now they had from the beginning, but now they incorporate even more because they need the manpower. They've lost so much of their army up to this point, they need the dang manpower. And of course, the communist ideology is very welcoming of this. It shirks the traditions that war is just a man's type of thing. So because of this, the manpower of the Soviet Union rises dramatically and way above the numbers that the Germans thought they'd have to deal with. This is a huge thing in just all World War II. The Germans thought that they were just going to be dealing with how many men that that the Russians or the Soviets could throw at them. They didn't realize that they have millions of women to deal with as well. And by the way, the women, there's some pretty crazy stories about them. I encourage you to look them up. I have a couple going in my mind right now, but this lesson's already going a bit too long. We're almost finished, but I'm just look them up. There's some pretty cool stories there, crazy stories too. So, but come November though, you get the December freeze. Basically, the winter comes on just much earlier. So the freeze that would have come in December comes in November. This actually was a bit of a blessing for the Germans because it froze everything. So all of a sudden, you can move again. Your tanks, your jeeps, your panzer divisions could move forward and start attacking. The problem with this, it was so cold that at times the gasoline or the oil froze in the gas tanks of the tanks and the trucks. Look this up, by the way. I think it's something like negative 67 degrees Fahrenheit is at the point that gasoline freezes. So again, you can look that up yourself if you'd like to, but that's crazy cold. And the German soldiers were not ready for the cold. They thought this was supposed to be done by September, and now they're going into November. And by the way, back in Germany, the citizens run huge clothing drives to get clothes out to their soldiers. It's actually kind of impressive how they are able to get that going. But most of the time, especially the frontline German soldiers, are just taking the warm clothes off of the dead Russian civilians or soldiers that they find, just anything to get to warm themselves up, because it gets pretty bad. Probably the biggest problem though for the Germans wasn't just the idea that sometimes gasoline would freeze. Their weapons stopped working, like the firing pins would crack on their machine pistols. The only rifle that was the only rifle during this point in World War II or in Operation Barbarossa, when it gets really cold, were the bolt-action rifles. So essentially the Russian Mosin Nagants or the German Kar-98s or Mauser rifles were the only rifles that were reliable at this point. Machine guns would just break. It was so cold. Because of this, the Germans didn't have what they needed to just finish the deal. They decided to push towards Moscow in this cold, just cut the head off of the snake. But the Soviets had enough time to prepare for this, and they actually were able to bring in a few 100,000 troops from the east back towards Japan. Actually, they were guarding their border with Japan. These were actually well-trained Siberian infantry, well-equipped. They knew how to fight in the cold, whereas the Germans didn't, and they're able to push the Germans back. And if you're looking at the dates there, this is something that I always find quite interesting and a nice coincidence. I don't know if maybe coincidence from December 7th, 1941. The Germans start retreating and call the all retreat basically December 5th to December 7th. And they're in full retreat by December 7th, meaning that this is the first time in the German history of World War II, or at least of the Nazi Empire, where they suffer a massive defeat like this in the Battle for Moscow. The coincidence I keep referring to is that that's the exact same day that Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and brings the United States into the war. So the same day Germany suffers its first major defeat in World War II is the exact same day that the United States gets involved in World War II. Hence even more why I personally view that day as probably the most important day of all World War II, not just from a United States perspective, but from a turning point of the war perspective. Anyways, that's the last little bit we're going to be going over here. We'll actually still be talking about the Eastern Front a bit when we get to things like Stalingrad and stuff like that. But this will be the end of this lesson of Operation Barbarossa. We'll see you guys later.